We start then, yeah?
Yeah. Good morning,
Okay.
everybody. So this is Science Meets Practice Tampere, and we have a Kimberly Wood from University of Applied Sciences of Jyväskylän presenting us her thesis about the investigation into training load and health for track and field national team throwing events. So we have been gathering data from our hammer, discus, and shot put throwers, and Kimberly will now tell you what is the relationship between training load and health problems. So, Kimberly, stage is yours.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, then let's get straight into it. An investigation into the training load and health. I do have a few more slides here, but I will go through the first 5 quite quickly. So that's who I am. I'm from the UK. I'm just doing this course. I've been graduate sports therapist since 2010. So let's go into it. Introduction. So yeah, Varela, in collaboration with the Finnish Olympic Committee, the key here, we're investigating hammer throw discus. So what, again, interactions between training load and health when October to December. Why are we doing it? Because combining these 2 platforms, we can facilitate a suitable training load, help ascertain correlations if there are any, and it can lead to potential innovations depending on the stuff. So hypothesis. So is it correlated? Is it not? And that will be a theme throughout this that I will repeat. This is just an overview, training load, internal, external to health. So we're just going to look at this short graph. We're just going to, with every graph I'm going to show you today, we're just going to try and get it in that green spot. And I'm basically going to be talking about the 0.8 to 1.3 a lot. So it's just a good graphic to show quickly. So yes, it was a prospective cohort study. It was to do the Champions Corner Oslo Health Questionnaire 2, and it started on 26th of September for 14 weeks. This is just a quick description of the training data, but I'm not going to tell you today. Instead, I'm going to explain it in the results. So the 3 definitions we're going to use mainly, the acute chronic 0.8 to 1.3 training, it needs to be 1 to 1.5, and the wellness score between above 1, below 1. And this is all I'm going to talk about for the next 25 minutes. So the stat itself. So I've grouped group 1, group 2, non-L and L. And we're basically going to go through the acute training load and the chronic training load over 2, 3 week and 4 week loading pattern. And we're also going to look at throwing volumes, strength volume into some parts about the plyometric. You'll understand why I said it that way a bit later. The injury severity score was the main aspect we got from the health questionnaire. And all this was done on SPSS Excel. So let's get to it. There were 10 subjects, 5 hammer, 2 discus, 3 shot put. I only use descriptive statistics, so we're going to go through a lot of graphs. I grouped them separately, but because they're average scores, we're going to do individual as well. So I've only got a couple of examples for you. I didn't want to put them all to hide their identity. So the results. The combined athlete averages. So this is combining acute training load, training, throwing to the wellness score together. We can see in group 1, which is the non-L, had 4 subjects, and group 2, which is the L side, had 6. So we can see like a big overview of, and then we'll get to the specifics as we go. So we can see group 1, it's fairly okay. There is ups and downs, what we should see. In group 2, the little dots represent an illness severity score. So from week 6 onwards, there was an illness. There were no injuries or illnesses. So let's look at it a little bit more specific. So the acute training load, group 1 being non-ill, you can see that it's a lot higher than the green one, and the green one stays quite low consistently. The only real differences, apart from the obvious, is that from week 1 they started too much too quickly, and this will be a recurring theme in the next few graphs, and 0 being before they had their summer holiday and had some form of training, but that is not being discussed today. But you can start to see there are differences. So if we take a look at chronic training load just by itself for a second, we've got 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and 4 weeks. And we're just going to see that there isn't too much difference between our 3 chronic patterns. We know from the actual data that you can look to 3 to 6 week chronic, but I just wanted to look at these specifically, because when we go to individual actual results, you will show more clear differences. But right now, again, group 1 non-ill much higher, ones who are ill much lower, and it's quite consistent no matter what chronic loading pattern you do decide to view. So let's look at the training aspect. The strength volume, it's a bit both ways. So the blue group, they do a lot more for consistently a longer period of time, and the greens, they jump straight into it, but it doesn't really go that high. It stays quite low in comparison. And then when we flip to the contacts of plyometric work, the two don't quite go together. So we've got week 1 high plyometric, and with the basic prep season, we don't really always want to see that. But then the blue group, who are the non-ill, they stay quite low. So it's just an aspect to be aware of. Again, this is just a better visual of the previous graphs before, the blue charts representing the strength volume, the plyometric line. So there is a bit of a difference, but albeit not too much one. Throwing volumes was a huge difference between the two. You've got group 1, non-ill, who don't do that much at the start, do more underweight. Then group 2, they start again a little bit low, but then they consistently do a lot more, but at a certain weight level. And so you can quite clearly see that for whatever the reason that may be, one group is doing a lot less, one group is doing a lot more. So now we've looked at the combined averages. We didn't see too much specific as to the acute to chronic and how that means for the workload ratio. So we can quite clearly see that group 1, who didn't get ill at all through the 14 weeks, that the acute chronic stays between them boundaries of 0.8 to 1.3. And yeah, it goes up and down, but it's quite even, it's quite consistent. The only thing we can obviously all see between the 2, 3 week and 4 week chronic is that first spike, but we can assume different factors. What happens week 1 and week 2? Was it the fact that they didn't train? Was it the fact they didn't put it into the platform? Or it's just a potential curve? So if we get past that and look at 4 weeks and to the 14, it's quite consistent. And with chronic loading coming up a bit higher, which is good for the athlete. But we can see that when we put training monotony, acute chronic workload ratio, acute training load, and the chronic together, we get an overall good picture of this athlete that we couldn't get from the combined. So same athlete, and we can see that from the throwing of the fast, they throw underweight quite a lot. Same situation with week 1, week 2, but it stays quite consistent. And strength training, they do quite a bit, so they are quite strong. This athlete in particular does good amount of strength training, good amount of throwing volume. The score, the Z score on the right. where if we take out that first spike, because that's just due to data beforehand, it stays quite even. It stays between the 1 and the 1, blue line representing 1 week, so it's slightly higher because it's only got the 1 week's data, but overall, it's a good picture for this athlete. So, group 2, and you can see straight away there's a huge difference. This person in particular got ill week 13, the blue dot, and week 14. So 13, they scored it as 100. So you know, they didn't train. It's the worst score for that. And there's a few issues going on with this athlete that we can see. So first of all, we've got week 1 to 3. If 2 and 3 are true data points, then 3 to 4, there's a unbelievable hike. And then again, there's a hike at 7, 10 to 14. And with there's a huge spike increase and there's a huge drop off, just as equal to it. So we've got 6 to 7, too much load. And then 8, 9, and 10 is you know, quite consistent with training, 10 being higher, but then there's a drop off again. They didn't report anything until week 13. It was still 0 to them 2 points, 11 and 12, but there's a few issues. What's like with the spike, with the drop off, and then when they got ill at 13, what's happening with 14? Why is that training load just as high? So we can beg the question that what's the return to play protocol for that particular illness for this particular athlete? But then we can see through the 2 week, 3 week, and 4 week that the acute chronic ratio workload is quite different in all of them. So for a good ratio from data suggests that it should be 0.8 to 1.3, but this one isn't consistent. It's only consistent for 2 weeks, but there's a lot going on with this particular athlete. So let's look at, this is the internal load. Let's look at more the external load. So this thrower, compared to the athlete I just shown you before, they just do competition weight constantly, not much variation at all. And then the strength training, yeah, you've got 2 points that are quite high, but consistently, you know, it's at the same point across. So compared to the other athlete before, there is quite a few differences. The Z-score, again, not much to show throughout. It's fairly normal. There is some peaks, but nothing too significant. So, second athlete. So I chose to show 2 examples of the ill athletes and 2 very good ones, because this one, I want to show illness at week 7, and then 4 weeks later, they again said they have an illness. The first one at week 7 shows the severity score is about 30. I think it was about 20 at the top of my head. And then 4 weeks later, it was 100. So I just wanted to show visually what that means with the training internally. So we've got from week 4, we've got spikes at 5, but it's only a tiny one, and then 7, 10, and 12. And from week 6 to 7, the load just jumps straight through. And then 8 to 9 comes back down quite significantly. 10, and then it goes back up again, and then goes to 0. And then number 12, it shoots straight back up and then back down. So you can see that there are more drop-offs and spikes in this particular athlete than the one before, but it's coming up with the same correlations. There's training load spikes, there's training load drop-offs. So it's just gathering that data together. And when we look at the injury severity score, 11 and 12 are 100, and they're training at week 12. So it's the case of, again, return to play. If at week 7, they had potentially adapted training, could that have led to re-illness, or is it a completely different illness entirely? And this is why we had to look at the 4 weeks chronic loading pattern, which you can see in the bottom right corner, to see 7-2, and it's the acute load was just higher. So it's telling you week by week, you know, you're at a risk of injury or illness. And that's quite important. So again, let's look at the external load of throwing and strength training. So we can see that this athlete, that the throws, you know, normal weight and overweight. And you can see from each athlete that I've shown you today that they're all very, very different. They all do very different things. And there's not much consistency. But if we're following sports training principles in a way, 0 being no exercise, or, you know, tiny bit, little bit, or off training, then you have 1 and 2. Strength training shows that they were training, but then in the other data does not. Then 3 is high and it's heavy, when we should be doing volume and tiny bit lighter. So the wellness, again, doesn't show too much. So it's just there to say that even though we are incorporating the fatigue and everything, the score together isn't significant enough when comparing with the acute training load versus health. So because I've spoke individually about athletes and then they're combined, from the combined athletes, we see a good picture, but then this picture shows the points of what is going on with the acute training load to chronic. So this is on the one who is non-ill, the other who is ill, and they're 2 completely different pictures. I've taken the 4 week because it's the most common chronic loading pattern through the literature, so it's just much easier to see. And then we see, so again, if we ignore that first 3 weeks, you know, we can say that the one who's not ill is, you know, has better, it flows better. We should see that nice little up and down curve you see with training, and the chronic loading pattern is a bit higher at many of the weeks. And we'll go into the reasons why that could be, what could be beneficial after this slide. And then when we go to the non-ill, you have huge spikes, but that's 3 to 4. If 3 value is true, then 3 to 4, it's a phenomenal difference. So hence the acute load is really, really high. But of course, it's looking at the 4 weeks one. So at the 4 week, just before that, it's like 2.8 above. And with acute training workload, anything above 1.5 is considered the danger zone. And we've got a lot when they go to illness after week 10, week 11, it just drops significantly. So that drop off is quite significant. And we'll go into other discussion in a second, but this is just a good way to sum up the average, the individual together, and to see the bigger picture, the comprehensive review of these athletes. So let's talk about all the graphs then. So the results shown that there is a correlation between health and training load, and we can see that in the final graphs put side by side. There is a difference quite. And so let's look at the reasons why they could be like that. So group 1 shows gradual progression in acute training load throughout all the weeks, and the high chronic loading pattern in all types of loading patterns than group 2. And yeah. And group 2 loads too quickly. And from the first week, and we see excessive spikes and drops, like I've said quite a few times, that happened throughout all the athletes of the ill group. Group 1 showed clear strength volume difference, and compared to group 2, the volume was significantly higher. Again, I've said this a few times, not much difference between the scores of the actual wellness, so how they felt, their mood, did they recover, did they feel sore. There wasn't too much, just that significant. Group 1 throwing volumes are a lot less in the first 6 weeks, predominantly underweight, whereas Group 2 volumes are higher, and predominantly the competition weight. So throwing volumes, we can't say too much about it. There isn't too much out there with it, but this is just a good picture of each athlete and what they did individually. And then when we look at the combined scores, we see actually there is a difference. And then Group 2 had an illness every week from week 6, and there was no sign of adapted training load to any significant severity score. So there were a few at 100. So if they're not training the week before, we should see adapted training load in some form of acute load or even the other aspects, and there wasn't any. So that is shown in all of the ill athletes. I know that I haven't gone through them all, but it's just showing all of them. So I've said the summary of the results. So I picked out 3 themes that I found. So higher chronic training load. Research does suggest that a stable chronic pattern, that is, so when you were to look at the graph, if the chronic training bar is higher than the acute, they say that that's a reduced risk of injury or illness. And some research suggests that that could have that chronic pattern that flows, that's gradual, would have a preventative effect for injury or illness. And that's important because with the Group 2, we saw that quite a lot of times acute training load was far higher than chronic. So it can suggest multiple things. Well, the main thing for me was the return to play guidelines. There wasn't any sign of adapted training. So the recommendations for illness would be that train once the infection is cleared, gradual process. It is specific to the athlete, I know, but increase training when symptom-free. And the trouble is that with the results, if one was less, they still did something else. So if they didn't do one aspect of training, they did another, but guidelines suggest you should not do any until you're symptom-free. And this graphic on the side, the graduation return to play protocol, was taken into 2020. It's about COVID, because one of these athletes got COVID and returned to play too quickly, considering. And this is a good graphic, the traffic light system, and it goes through each levels, what the objective is, and how to get back to full training. So it's just a good visual that I quite like. Excessive training load spikes. So there were sudden increases, sudden drops. And if you look through all the research with training load spikes, you'll find that both ways do increase the risk of illness and injury. So, conclusion. So I put together the combination results between the Group 1 and Group 2, and it gave a pretty good overview of what's happening with all the athletes in a section. And it was good to keep narrowing down from that. And as I kept narrowing, it was more important to check the individual data so that we can say that there was a spike, there was a drop. Because when you look at averages, when we're combining everyone, it can become a bit skewed. And so it's important to have both together, and that could determine the correlation altogether. So other considerations was the 1 week to 3 was, did they input the data, or was they just getting used to the training platforms? It was a lot of information to get going. There are teething problems. So I didn't always talk about that 3 to 4. So, when there was some sort of level, we just looked at that period of time, but that period of time is a bit short. And a consideration with these athletes when we're looking at averages, the internal load, the RPE, can be higher for one athlete than another athlete. So individual data just shows that their specific load, and we can get an overall bigger picture of all the athletes, of all the individual, and we can check bias to non-bias in a way, and we can get an overview that is more on both sides of the scale. And because I only had 10 subjects, so 6 and 4, when you split the groups down, you would need to have a bigger population, and it would have better average combined scores because you'd be able to see the bigger picture on multiple levels, but it was just a little bit too small, hence why we had to have lots of graphs and lots of little descriptions. And this study has become to show that there are significant spikes. So why that is happening, why it's dropping off so much so quickly within a week, that needs to be looked at as to why that's happening. This group would benefit from better return to play guidelines. And I also have to ask the question with this, do the athletes, do they understand what return to play is? Do they know where to go, what to do? So there's also that element. I can't directly say, that, but that would be my advice. And then in the future, it would be better to see if all these correlations are true throughout the season, because we're looking at such a short period of time and we've had to knock off a couple of weeks. So it's about 10 weeks altogether. It is such a short period of time and it's in a particular part of the season. So when we look through the competition level as well, can we see a bigger picture? Can we see the averages being better in the throwing, in the acute, in the chronic, in all these different loading patterns? And to get the bigger picture, and that would be better for the athletes, for the coaches, and ultimately for the sport. But yeah, that is my little presentation. Thank you for paying attention.